Hello, my friends. You might know I am planning on painting a Valentine's Day image for my cards and stickers. It's coming up. So today I will be using that same reference photo in this tutorial, but I won't be painting the whole image because I think that would be just way too complicated for the here. So I'm going to be painting these strawberries. And I've got my sketch laid out. You can see the extra resources if you'd like to use it as a guide for your drawing. And in this tutorial, you can get as detailed as you'd like in this painting. You can simplify these steps to have a more minimalistic look. You don't have to go as detailed as I do. It's up to you. So for the color mixing, you're going to grab your palette and some scraps of paper for testing your colors. I like to swatch the colors I may be using before beginning. That way I can gauge the pigments that are in my palette and what's closest to my desired color for the painting. And then once I have a starting color, I can tweak the color from there. And for this painting, I wanted to start out with two reds. So I mix kind of an orangey red. So I take a base of orange, whatever orange you have, and then add a little bit of red to it. And I want the mixture to be more orange than it is red. And then I also want to mix more of a vibrant fire truck red, and basically you're gonna start out with a red base and then add a little bit of orange to that. And I grabbed these Viva watercolors to add a bit more saturation with the red, and I wanted it more saturated than my Daniel Smith paints, which weren't doing it for me. Sometimes they are just a little subdued, which is great. I love Daniel Smith, but sometimes I just want a little more, you know? So I mix up a golden yellow as well. The yellow mixed with a bit of orange should do for this. This will be the base colors for the strawberries because the seeds are actually very light. So the first layer, if you analyze the reference photo, like I said, the seeds are quite light in color, and in watercolor you have to paint the lightest colors first, and we will paint this strawberry, this golden yellow color, and then wait for it to dry. And then what we'll do is we'll use masking fluid to preserve the light color of the strawberry seeds. And if you do not have masking fluid, then you can skip this step, and instead of light colored seeds, you would simply paint them with a darker watercolor at the very end. And I'll show you an example of this with my extra resources that I post. And so I'm going to use the masking fluid before we begin with the first layer, and I want to preserve the whitest highlights of the strawberry. So I use my fine tip masking pen to block in those white shapes. This step is optional. Like I said, if you don't have masking fluid, you can actually use white gouache at the end to paint on these details as well. When I paint, I often just paint the shapes that I see, and the more contrast between the lightest light and the darkest dark really adds to the realism of a painting. And I let the masking fluid dry completely before painting over it. I often will use a hairdryer to speed up the process because I'm a little impatient. So the first layer is that yellowy orange color, which is the color of the seeds. And once the paint dries, we will add another layer of masking fluids on the seeds, which will preserve their lightness. Then we can just paint right over top of them with the red pigment. And I always like using the biggest brush I can because it makes the work go quicker. And if you get too much water on your paintbrush and you start to get puddles of water, which is harder to control and will take longer to dry, just simply use a paper towel to wipe up some of that water. And if you also make a mistake, say when I'm painting the strawberry, I get some color on the leaves, wipe it with your finger or paper towel right away, and it should come off. And I dry this layer with a hair dryer. Now that it's dry, I'm going to go ahead and apply the masking fluid onto the seeds. That way I don't have to paint around them when it comes time to paint the red. This is obviously an optional step, like I said. If you want to paint the seeds a darker color at the end, then that works too. And then yet again, I dry it with a hair dryer. Just speeds up the whole process. The second layer is the red color, and I've got my two reds mixed up, and I bring out the salt once again to add some texture to the paint. And I'm going to apply the orange to the lightest part of the strawberries, that orangey red, where the light source is hitting, and you can tell because those white highlights are the brightest point of the strawberry. So that's the kind of area you want to put that orange color. And if you look at the reference photo, there is a shine here. The light is hitting that, creating a kind of a lighter pigment. And that's where we're going to put our lightest colors. And the shadows are kind of blending to near the bottom of the strawberry where it's touching the table. And I start by putting down the orangey red in the middle of the strawberry where I see those highlights, and the fire truck red goes along the edges. So don't dilute the colors with the water too much. Keep them a bit more concentrated if you can. Now you will need to mix more red as you go along. I used quite a bit of it, and I had to remix it a few times. Just use your scrap piece of paper to color match as the best as you can. That's why it's pretty handy to use an extra sheet of paper. And for the next two strawberries, the highlights are actually on the top, and you want to apply that orange mixture to this area, and then filling in with the red at the bottom. And again, if you get too much water on your brush and it starts pooling on the painting, you can soak it up with a little extra paper towel. Also be aware that when you paint next to an area that is already wet, those two objects will bleed into each other. So if you do not wish for this to happen, you have to wait for the first object to dry, or leave a little bit of space so that the water, like I said, doesn't bleed into each other. And this is actually really important when you have two objects of pretty different colors and you don't want them to mix. With the strawberries, because it's all kind of a mixture of red and orange, it's not super important, but it's just definitely something to keep in mind. And I say this because I don't actually want the two strawberries on the right to bleed into each other, because I've got a dark area hitting a light area. So I leave a little extra space in between as a barrier. And I want another shade, a little bit darker red for the shadowing of the strawberries. So I take my existing red mixture and I add a bit of, you can add a bit of purple or blue. And I just keep adding a little bit at a time until I'm happy with how dark I want it. And while the last layer is still wet, I apply the dark burgundy color, the dark red, to the bottoms of the strawberries, and that will just like blend together. And I remember also change your water throughout this process. As soon as it starts to get too cloudy, I dry this layer with a hair dryer, and once it's dry, I'm going to go over the bottom of the strawberries with that same shadow color again. So I apply that, and then I blend the edge with a clean brush that I've wiped off the excess water with, and that will blend those two areas together. And I do that with all three of the berries, blending your edges so that the shadow line isn't too harsh. And I just keep dropping the dark shade into the wet paint until I'm satisfied by its intensity. And because there's a very strong shadow on that right bottom strawberry, I go in again when I've dried the layer with the hair dryer again. I add a touch more purple into the mixture just to darken it up and go over it one last time, because it like I said, it's a bit of a stronger shadow, and I blend those edges with my clean brush. Once again, we are completely drying the paint again. Normally, if I'm doing a large painting, I don't have to use the hairdryer as much. So what I'll do in a larger painting is I will add a layer to a section and then just let it naturally dry, and I will go and work on something else. And I'll kind of bounce around the painting as the layers dry on their own. But because this is such a small painting, I kind of have to speed that process up. And it's at this point where I go ahead and peel off the masking fluid. Next, I am going to go and add some shadows where the leaves touch the berries. Using the mixture I prepped previously, that kind of red burgundy. And because the leaves cast shadows on the berry, and it's subtle, but when you're going for a more realistic look, these little tiny details matter. And as you get more advanced on reading your reference photos, you will be able to kind of see those small details and add those in. But if you don't want to go for a super realistic strawberry, by all means, leave this step out. And it's at this point that if you want to go for a simpler strawberry look and you haven't used the masking fluid, then go ahead and paint your darker seeds on top of this red color, and then move on to the green leaves. The leaves, I want to mix two shades, a light and a dark. I have this Gold Green by Daniel Smith, and it's basically like a light green with quite a bit of yellow in it, and it's one of my favorite colors. I love this color so much. But if you don't have something similar to this, pick a shade of green that you have and then add some yellow into it, and you'll get pretty close. And so I add this light layer to all the leaves, and I move to a smaller brush actually, because this area is fairly small to do with a larger brush. Moving on to the table shadow. So while the first layer of the leaves is drying, I'm going to mix up the color for the shadows of the strawberry that the strawberries cast on the table. And you would think that the shadows would just be like a watered down black, but it isn't. Because the strawberries are red, the shadow that they cast on the table is actually a warm gray. And how I mix this is I start out with a base of purple, and I mix some blue into it, and I water it down quite a bit. I turned it into way too blue, so I added some brown, and you can see that the color is quite dark. So I moved some of that pigment over into the compartment next to it, so that I can add a lot of water to it to water it down. So the mixture was created basically using I used a base of the red. I mixed in blue, purple, and brown and watered it down, and you should get like a nice warm gray. And I start out pretty light just in case I overdo it with the first shadow. In watercolor, once you go dark, you can't really take that darkness away. So often when I'm working with these like strong shadows and like prominent features, I want to just start out light, and then I'll build up the layers as I go. And I clean my brush and wipe off the excess water with a paper towel, and I blend that edge out so it's not such a harsh line. And then I go ahead and I drop some of that darker pigment closer to the strawberry while the paint is still wet, and it will naturally just blend itself. Then I move on to the next shadow on the left hand side, blending those edges as well. And I'm going to let it dry and move on to the second layer of the leaves. Layer 2 on the leaves, we will darken that base color that we used previously. And I add in some dark green, and then I add a bit of blue to desaturate the color because it's just a little bit too vibrant. We want to tone it down a bit. And paying attention to the reference photo, I paint the underside of the leaves, painting those shapes that I see. And I extend that green on top of the left strawberry. And there's a strong shadow on the strawberry itself. So I use that color and kind of blend it out. And this is the point where I mix actually a third green, and I wanted to break up the light and the dark color. I thought there was just it's too big of a jump. So I mix up a mid-tone between the two greens that I previously mixed. So I use this spring green, and I add a touch of purple to kind of tone it down a bit, but as long as it's a shade in the middle of that dark and light color, you should be fine. And I bring out the salt to add some texture. I'm just kind of trying to break up because there's a lot of that light leaf color, and it's just flat. So I'm trying to bring in some texture and some variation with the mid-tone, and I apply some salt to that just to kind of create some interest. And now I just want to make the table shadow a bit stronger. It's a little too light, so I'm going to have to add another layer. I clean off my brush, wipe off the excess water, and blend those edges out again. I add quite a few layers to the table shadow just because I just keep thinking, oh, it's got to be a bit darker, it's got to be a bit darker. And I notice at this point that the seeds are not all the same color. Some of the seeds are a touch darker than the rest. So as the strawberry, that dark color gets closer and closer to the table, those seeds also get darker. So I take the color that I did for the table shadow, and I do a light wash on the strawberry where I think those seeds are darkening, which kind of rounds off the strawberry a little. I now pull out my white gouache. I use this, this is my favorite that I've tried. I've tried a lot of different brands, and this Dr. Martens Bleed Proof White is my favorite. It's fantastic. So I use my white gouache to clean up all the white details. When you use masking fluids, sometimes the white areas aren't as smooth as I'd like them to be. And so I use this to clean up all those small details, making the edges not so jagged. And I actually stopped painting this for a while. I had to get dinner ready and everything. And then when I put my daughter to bed, I noticed that the shadow, the table shadow, was not strong enough. And so a lot of the times we put down paintings and then we come back to them with fresh eyes, and we are able to see the details that may need adjusting, and it's really good. Sometimes if you're feeling very frustrated with a painting, I suggest putting it down and coming back to it after a couple of hours or a day or two, and you'll be able to sit down with a little more clarity and calm. So when I noticed that the shadow on the left hand side was not nearly strong enough, I mixed up some more of the shadow color and I begin darkening up that one last time, because if that shadow isn't strong enough, the strawberry just feels kind of like it's floating. So the shadow really grounds it to say like, hey, I'm on a table, I'm on a surface. I hope you found some of this information useful, and I hope that everyone got to participate, whether you're doing a more simplified version or something a little bit more detailed. I try my best to kind of cover both in these tutorials. Sometimes I'll do something a little bit more complicated, and then I'll switch it up and do something really fun and simple. And I think it's good to do both. We want to progress our skills and challenge ourselves, but we also want to keep this painting fun, and so it's good to try both. And I will see you in the next video.